Let go of my father, and the Virgin Mary will make you walk again.
The boy's voice, thin but firm, only 7 years old, cut through the courtroom like a lightning bolt. For a second, no one breathed. Then, laughter, as if everyone had rehearsed it together. They laughed at his faded blue shirt, his worn-out shoes, and at the absurd idea that a child could challenge the most feared judge in Arizona. But Richard Cole didn't laugh, not because he believed, but because for the first time in 15 years, something inside him hesitated. This is a story about faith, justice, and the unexplainable power that can soften even the hardest of hearts. But before we continue, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'd love to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. That gray morning in Phoenix, the courtroom felt like a cathedral of despair. At the center of it all sat Judge Richard Cole, motionless in his motorized wheelchair, with the steel gaze of a man who no longer knew mercy. No one dared challenge him in his presence. Do you know someone like that? The kind of person who walks into a room and makes the air feel heavier? Richard Cole was exactly like that, but he hadn't always been. 15 years earlier, he swam competitively, played tennis with friends on the weekends. He believed justice and compassion could walk side by side, until the night his motorcycle skidded on a rain-soaked highway. He survived, but lost the movement of his legs forever. And little by little, he lost his soul as well. The first months were a battle. Catherine, his wife, tried to stay by his side. 2 years of silent effort trying to reach a man sinking deeper and deeper into bitterness. But the man she loved had vanished, swallowed by anger. The divorce came in 2010. Catherine moved to Seattle, taking with her the last remains of light he still had. Alone in a minimalist apartment with no photos on the walls, no happy memories, surrounded only by piles of legal cases and a mechanical routine, Richard Cole became the most feared judge in Arizona. Emotional appeals didn't touch him. Mitigating circumstances didn't interest him. The staff respected him, but they feared him too. Experienced lawyers did everything to avoid having their cases assigned to his courtroom. Defendants' families wept when they heard his name. Richard had built a fortress of ice around his heart, and nothing, no one, could break through it. Until that February day. In a modest suburb of Phoenix, there lived a family whose destiny would soon cross paths with Judge Cole. Daniel Morris, 42 years old, had been a carpenter for more than 18 years. Calloused hands that built, repaired, created. He worked before the sun rose and returned when the stars were already painting the sky. A widower for 4 years, he raised his son Noah alone, a 7-year-old boy with light brown hair and attentive green eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than his age allowed. Since the passing of his mother Claire, the two had been inseparable. The house was simple, walls that needed painting, old but well-kept furniture, photos of Claire everywhere. In the boy's room, on the small shelf beside the bed, there was a statue of the Virgin Mary that had belonged to his mother. Before she passed, Claire had made Daniel promise that he would raise their son in the faith. Every night, Noah knelt beside the bed and prayed with the rosary. The worn wooden bead slipped between his small fingers as he asked for protection for his father and for anyone in the world who might be suffering. To Noah, the Virgin Mary was not just an image. She was a living, loving presence, always willing to listen. Life was not easy. Money barely covered the basics, but it was a life full of love. Daniel supported the household with honest effort, and he never lacked in presence, affection, or attention. Noah was loved by everyone. At school, the teachers praised his kindness and intelligence. He was one of the best students in the class, but he never bragged about it. On the contrary, he helped classmates who struggled, always with a smile on his face and words of encouragement. They were a simple family, but they were rich in character, in faith, and in hope. But in January of 2023, their peaceful lives were destroyed by an accusation that would change everything forever. It was a freezing January morning when the Morris family's life was turned upside down. Daniel was in the backyard preparing his tools for another day of work when 3 police cars stopped in front of the house. Noah, who had been preparing his lunchbox for school in the kitchen, heard the noise and ran to the window. "Daniel Morris?" the detective asked, tall and impassive. "Yes, that's me." "You are under arrest for the robbery that occurred at the downtown watch shop last week. You have the right to remain silent." Daniel froze. Robbery? He had never taken anything that wasn't his. Not even a pen forgotten on a counter. "There must be a mistake. I didn't do this." "Tell that to the judge," the detective replied, handcuffing his wrists. Noah dropped the lunchbox to the floor. Orange juice spread across the tiles. "Dad!" "Stay calm, son," Daniel said, forcing a smile, even though his heart was breaking. "It's going to be okay. Daddy didn't do anything wrong." But nothing would be resolved any time soon. Their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her early 60s who had lived next door since Noah was a baby, wrapped her arms around the boy as the police cars drove away with the only family he had in the world. Hours later, the details came to light. The watch shop had been broken into days earlier. Security footage showed a man wearing a jacket similar to Daniel's. 2 witnesses reported seeing someone with a similar description leaving the area shortly after the incident. GPS data placed Daniel's phone near the location, and the most damning piece of evidence, one of the watches was found under the seat of Daniel's car during the police search. To anyone looking from the outside, the case seemed solid. To anyone who knew him, it was absurd. Daniel Morris had never taken anything that wasn't his. He was a man of principles who had taught his son it was better to face hardship than to take what didn't belong to him. Alan Foster, a public defender, took the case. He had experience, but he worked overloaded, with few resources and dozens of cases stacked on his desk. When he visited Daniel in pretrial detention, he found a completely broken man. "I swear on Claire's memory," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "I didn't do this. My son already lost his mother. He can't lose his father, too." Foster believed him, but he knew proving innocence was much harder than proving guilt, especially with evidence so perfect. And there was one last problem. The case would be judged by Richard Cole. While Daniel withered in pretrial detention, Noah lived a nightmare. Mrs. Patterson had taken him temporarily into her home. The lady did everything she could. She prepared his favorite meals, tried to distract him with movies, offered her lap whenever he cried. But Noah cried every night, clinging to his pillow, begging for his father. At school, he couldn't focus. He stared out the window during class, lost in thought. The teachers tried to comfort him. In vain. His classmates tried to cheer him up with jokes. He barely responded. Every night, kneeling beside the bed in Mrs. Patterson's house, Noah held his mother's rosary and whispered, "Virgin Mary, you saw what happened. You know my father didn't do this. Please help people see the truth." But Noah wasn't praying only for his father's release. He also prayed for the judge, even without knowing who he was. "Virgin Mary," he continued in his nightly pleas, "if the man who will judge my father can't see the truth, enlighten his eyes." They were prayers of such purity that Mrs. Patterson had never witnessed anything like it. Sometimes she stood at the door listening in secret and had to wipe her own tears. Meanwhile, defender Alan Foster did everything he could. He questioned evidence, searched for inconsistencies in testimonies, tried to buy time. But he knew it would be nearly impossible to win against prosecutor Vanessa Grant, known for her coldness and for never losing a case. On the eve of the trial, Noah couldn't sleep. He spent hours kneeling until dawn, praying with an intensity that even frightened Mrs. Patterson. "My dear, you need to rest," the elderly woman said, gently touching the boy's shoulder at 2 in the morning. Noah looked up at her with those big, serious green eyes. "Do you think miracles really exist?" Mrs. Patterson hesitated. She was a practicing Catholic, but the last few years had tested her faith in ways she never thought possible. Still, looking at that boy with such pure hope in his eyes, something inside her warmed. "Yes, dear," she whispered with tearful eyes. "I believe so, and maybe a miracle from the Virgin Mary is exactly what will save your father." Noah smiled for the first time in weeks. "Then I'm going to ask for a miracle. I'm going to ask the Virgin Mary to show the truth to everyone." And he made a silent promise that Mrs. Patterson didn't hear, but that would echo through time. "Virgin Mary, if you save my father, I will spend my whole life telling everyone I meet about your love." The courtroom was more crowded than usual that February morning. Noah arrived holding Mrs. Patterson's hand, wearing his best clothes, a light blue shirt like the mantle of the Virgin Mary that his mother loved so much. In the school backpack he carried on his back were the wooden rosary and a small picture of the Virgin Mary. When he saw his father being brought in by the security guards, Noah tried to run toward him, but he was gently restrained by Mrs. Patterson. "Calm down, dear. Soon, very soon, you'll be able to hug each other," she whispered, even without fully believing her own words. Daniel looked at his son and forced a smile, trying to convey strength even though he was completely shattered inside. Judge Richard Cole entered in his motorized wheelchair with the expression everyone knew: cold, calculating, completely impassive. His eyes swept across the crowded room without showing any emotion. To him, that was just another case, another morning of work, another number in the statistics. But when his gaze briefly passed over Noah, something strange happened. For an almost imperceptible second, he felt a small twinge in his chest that he couldn't explain. He quickly ignored it. The boy observed him with intense eyes, not with fear or anger, but with something Richard Cole hadn't recognized in years, something that seemed like hope. Prosecutor Vanessa Grant presented the case brilliantly and mercilessly, like a perfectly rehearsed theatrical performance. The evidence was laid out methodically. "Members of the jury," Grant said with a theatrical and confident voice, "the evidence is irrefutable. Daniel Morris is guilty and must pay the maximum price the law allows." When Grant finished her presentation, a heavy certainty hung in the air that Daniel would be convicted. The evidence seemed far too solid to be challenged. Some jurors had already made up their minds. Alan Foster did the best he could in the defense. He questioned the quality of the camera footage. The lighting was poor. The angle didn't clearly show the face. He pointed out inconsistencies in the witnesses' statements. He raised reasonable doubt about how the clock had stopped in Daniel's car. He presented testimonies from people in the community attesting to Daniel's impeccable character. But against the weight of the material evidence presented by the prosecution, everything seemed weak, insufficient. And by the frozen look in Judge Richard Cole's eyes, there was no hope at all. Then came the crucial moment, the final statements and the sentence. Grant delivered his closing argument with calculated drama, speaking about justice being served and protecting society. Foster made one last emotional plea, speaking about Noah, about a family being destroyed, about the importance of being absolutely certain before separating a father from his son. Beautiful words. Sincere words, but they echoed in the emptiness of the cold courtroom. Judge Richard Cole adjusted his glasses, organized his papers with mechanical movements, and positioned his pen. His voice cut through the silence like a sharp blade. Daniel Morris, after careful analysis of all the evidence presented in this court, considering the testimonies and the material proofs, it was exactly at that moment that something extraordinary happened. No. A thin but surprisingly firm voice shot across the courtroom like lightning splitting the sky. Everyone turned, shocked by the interruption at the most solemn moment of the trial. Noah Morris was standing, already stepping out of the row where he had been silently sitting beside Mrs. Patterson. The woman tried to hold him. "Noah, you can't—" But the boy was already walking with small but determined steps toward the center of the courtroom. A murmur spread through the room like a wave. Judge Cole frowned, clearly irritated by the unprecedented interruption. Noah stopped right in front of the elevated podium where the judge watched him with growing impatience. Even at 7 years old, he understood the gravity of the moment. He knew he was challenging the most powerful man in that room, but something greater than fear pushed him forward. "I am Noah Morris," he said, his voice trembling, but not failing. "I am his son." He pointed at Daniel, who stared back in absolute shock. "And you can't do this. You can't convict my dad." Judge Cole leaned slightly forward, his eyes half closed in poorly disguised irritation. "Boy, this is a court of law, not a place for—" Noah cut him off, something that made everyone in the room hold their breath. "I know what a court is." For a moment that felt eternal. Richard Cole said nothing. There was something in that boy's determination that unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. It was a courage without calculation, without artifice, without fear, pure and raw. A kind of bravery he hadn't seen since when? He couldn't remember. "You have 60 seconds, he finally said, and his voice came out less cold than he intended. Noah took a deep breath. His small hands were trembling, but his feet stayed firmly on the floor. Slowly, he opened his school backpack. He carefully took out his mother's rosary. Noah held the rosary between his hands and looked directly into the empty eyes of Judge Richard Cole. "Your Honor," he said with a voice carrying absolute conviction, "my father didn't do what that lady over there said." He pointed at Prosecutor Grant. "And the Virgin Mary knows that. She will show the truth." The laughter began, first timid, almost embarrassed, then more audible, then blatant. Prosecutor Grant laughed loudly, not even trying to hide her disdain. Attorneys in the first rows exchanged glances filled with a mix of pity and amusement. "Poor kid," someone murmured. But Noah didn't step back a single inch. He raised his voice above the growing noise of the laughter and said the words that would change everything. "If you release my dad, the Virgin Mary will make you walk again." The room practically exploded. Cruel laughter ricocheted off the marble walls of the courtroom. Malicious comments multiplied like fire in dry grass. Some even clapped ironically, as if they had just watched a comedy performance. Judge Cole struck his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order, but the room was completely out of control. But Noah Morris, 7 years old, with his faded blue shirt and his worn rosary beads, wasn't intimidated. He didn't step back. He didn't cry. He knelt right there, in the middle of the courtroom, before hundreds of people mocking him as if he were part of a circus act. He closed his eyes, held the rosary with both small hands, and began to pray out loud, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." His voice cut through the chaos like a blade of pure faith. Some laughed even harder. Others gradually began to fall silent. There was something disturbingly sincere about that scene. Noah kept praying, silent tears running down his face, but his voice remained steady, clear, unshakable. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen." And it was exactly at that moment that something completely impossible began to happen. Richard Cole began to feel something he hadn't felt in 15 years. It started as just a light tingling in his right leg, an almost imperceptible itch on his left ankle. So subtle that at first he thought it was just some strange emotional reaction to the bizarre scene unfolding in his courtroom. But the tingling didn't go away. It intensified. It turned into a warm, living sensation climbing up his calf like small waves of pulsing electricity. It was something he hadn't felt since the motorcycle accident in 2008. Richard gripped the arms of his wheelchair so hard that his knuckles turned completely white. His heart began to race uncontrollably. It's not possible, he thought desperately. It's psychological, nothing more. But the sensation intensified even further. Richard tried to hide what was happening. He gripped the armrests of the chair even tighter, attempted to keep the impassive expression everyone knew so well. But inside, he was in absolute panic. "This can't be happening," he repeated to himself like a frantic mantra. The doctors were categorical. Impossible. Impossible. And then it happened. For approximately 7 seconds, seconds that felt like an eternity suspended in time, Richard Cole felt his legs completely. They weren't phantom sensations. They weren't illusions caused by stress. It was total control. 7 miraculous, impossible, inexplicable seconds. Richard let out a sound that was somewhere between a moan and a muffled scream. He bent forward in the chair, his hands gripping his own knee, as if he needed to confirm it was real. The entire courtroom froze. The laughter stopped instantly. Every eye turned to the most feared judge in Arizona. "Your Honor!" The clerk stood up, visibly concerned. Noah stopped praying and slowly opened his eyes. He looked at the judge with those green eyes filled with hope. Richard tried desperately to regain his composure, but his hands continued trembling uncontrollably. The sensation had passed, but the burning memory of those 7 seconds scorched every fiber of his being. With a hoarse, cracked, almost inaudible voice, he murmured, This session is adjourned." He tried to reach for the gavel to make the announcement official, but the gavel slipped from his trembling hands and hit the floor with a crash that echoed through the silent courtroom like thunder. 5 hours later, Richard Cole was in the office of the neurologist who had been treating him for 14 years. The doctor lifted his eyes from the chart, surprised. "Richard, did something happen? Your last tests were only 4 months ago." "It changed." Richard's voice came out strained, desperate. "Something happened today. I felt my legs." The doctor leaned forward, genuine concern on his face. "Richard, sometimes situations of extreme stress can cause sensations that feel real but are actually—" "It wasn't an illusion," Richard practically shouted. "It wasn't stress. It wasn't imagination. I felt the pressure of my feet against the footrest. For several seconds, I had total control." The doctor remained silent for a long moment. He had known Richard Cole for more than a decade. He knew he was not a man prone to fantasies or exaggerations. "We're going to redo the tests." Richard left the office trembling on the inside, unable to process what was happening. While Richard Cole dealt with his own impossible crisis, Detective Sarah decided to review the Morris case. Something didn't add up in her meticulous mind. How could a man with no criminal record, known throughout the community as an honest worker, commit something like that overnight? Digging deeper into the records, Wu discovered something crucial. Daniel Morris had worked on the renovation of 4 stores on that same street during that week. He had legitimate, documented reasons to be in that area. Then she found a file that made her stomach tighten. Marcus Webb, also a carpenter. Extremely similar to Daniel Morris. They could have been brothers. Webb had been released 3 days before the incident, with bail paid by a firm that, upon investigation, Wu discovered did not exist. Obtaining a court warrant, Wu examined Daniel Morris's car again, this time paying closer attention to the details. And she found it. The lock on the rear door had been forced from the outside, clear marks of tools, something that had been completely ignored in the initial report. "Someone put the watch there afterward," she murmured to herself. Tracking who had access to the vehicle after it was impounded, she reached a name: Tyler Banks, a junior assistant only 24 years old at the prosecutor's office. Digging deeper into Banks's life, she discovered he was drowning in debt. And Marcus Webb's close friend from school. When he was confronted in an interrogation room, Tyler Banks fell apart in less than 10 minutes. "Marcus begged me," he cried. "He has 2 small children. I thought no one would ever find out. It was just to shift the blame." He confessed to planting the watch, altering data in the system. Prosecutor Vanessa Grant never knew she had been deceived by the very assistant she trusted. The confession was recorded, documented, and sent directly to Judge Richard Cole. Meanwhile, at the neurological clinic, the doctor finished analyzing the imaging results with an expression Richard had never seen on his face: absolute disbelief. "Richard," the doctor said, taking off his glasses and nervously cleaning them, "I need you to look at this with me. Your spinal cord injury is still present." A long, heavy pause. "But there is something I cannot understand. There is neuronal activity in areas that, in recent years, had none. It means they are, I don't know how else to put this, regenerating. It is something that should theoretically be impossible, given the type and extent of your injury. Is it possible for me to regain movement, to walk again?" The doctor put his glasses back on and looked directly into Richard's eyes. "Theoretically, it should be impossible. But what I am seeing in these images," he pointed to specific areas, "there is a real chance, Richard. I cannot promise anything, but there is a concrete possibility." Richard left the clinic with his world completely turned upside down. When the trial resumed 5 days later, the courtroom was even more crowded than before. Rumors about the incident had spread like wildfire. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. Detective Sarah Wu presented the new evidence in a methodical and irrefutable manner. Tyler Banks's full confession, the identification of Marcus Webb as the true culprit, the technical proof that the watch had been planted in Daniel's car. Richard Cole, still processing his own impossible miracle, listened to everything in silence. After a complete and careful review of the irrefutable new evidence presented to this court, pause. This court declares Daniel Morris completely innocent of all charges. There was something different in his voice, something no one could identify, but it was there. "Mr. Morris, you are free to go." He looked directly at Daniel. "And please accept my sincere apologies for what you and your family were forced to endure." They were words Richard Cole had never spoken in 15 years on the bench. Daniel and Noah ran toward each other. "Dad, I knew it! I knew the Virgin Mary would help." Richard Cole watched the scene from his wheelchair. Something inside him had broken in an irreversible way in that courtroom 5 days earlier. And at the same time, something new had begun to grow. Something he thought had been dead forever. 3 months passed. Richard Cole was no longer the same judge. He was still strict, still applied the law with precision. But now he truly listened. He considered circumstances. He looked at defendants as people with complex stories, not just numbers in case files, and his legs kept improving. Each week brought small but measurable gains, more sensation, more control, more strength gradually returning. 6 months after that day in court, on a warm August morning, Richard Cole woke up feeling a clear difference. They were no longer sporadic tingles or vague sensations. It was real strength. During breakfast, he tested it. He contracted his thigh muscle. It responded perfectly with control he hadn't had the previous week. He placed his hands on the kitchen table, took a deep breath, and stood up. His legs trembled like thin branches in the wind, but they held his weight. For the first time in 15 years, Richard Cole was standing on his own. He took a step, hesitant, unsure, leaning on the table, then another, steadier, then one more. He walked across the kitchen slowly, but he walked. After 15 years confined to a wheelchair, Richard Cole was walking. A 7-year-old boy changed the destiny of a judge hardened by years of bitterness and the lives of everyone who was present in that impossible courtroom. What happened there cannot be explained in medical books, nor in legal manuals, nor in scientific theories. It was a miracle of the Virgin Mary, born from the impossible faith of a boy who believed when the whole world mocked him. A boy who knelt when everyone laughed, who prayed when there was no hope left. Perhaps the greatest power of miracles is exactly this. They happen when a heart kneels completely, even if everyone around is laughing. May the same love that restored the legs of Richard Cole and the freedom of Daniel Morris touch your life as well. May the Virgin Mary heal your invisible wounds, restore what seemed lost forever, make flourish again what you thought was gone. Because the miracles of the Virgin Mary are still happening. And the next one may be yours, if you open your heart to her intercession. Before we finish, I want to invite you to be part of our prayer community to the Virgin Mary, a place of faith and hope, where people from all over the world unite to pray and share the graces they have received. If you feel in your heart the desire to be part of this prayer chain, click below and become a member of the channel today, and come pray with us. And look, if you got this far, to the end of Noah's story and Judge Cole's story, do something for me. Write in the comments, "He walked," the two words that summarize the impossible that happened. I want to see how many hearts this story truly reached, and every time I read "He walked" in the comments, I will know that one more person believes that the miracles of the Virgin Mary still happen. If this story strengthened your faith, subscribe to the channel right now to follow more testimonies and miracles of the Virgin Mary.